the Rocks. I really like Advent of the Worm. I wish I could play stuff like that. And this is sort of the genesis of that, as we see Gonzalo Velasquez, his opponent on white-black humans, is going to play a turn 1 Temple of Silence. Mike Reilly is going to play a Temple of his own on turn 1. That's Temple of Abandon. Mike is going to ponder that one for a second before putting it on the bottom.
And a lot of power in the Naya deck.
Yeah, absolutely. He's got 3 copies of Advent of the Worm in addition to the regulars like Gorklan Rampager, Stormbreath Dragon, and Pelucranos the World Eater. As we see, Gonzalo plays a Soldier of the Pantheon, but no second land drop. So a turn 2, 2-1 is going to be immediately stymied by Mike's Sylvan Caryatid.
And Caryatid's so good against beatdown decks. 3 toughness, stops a lot of the 2-1, the Jackal Pup type of creatures, and accelerating your mana is so powerful against these decks
Gonzalo
too.
finds himself a second mana, plays it untapped, a Godless Shrine untapped pre-combat, and then does a bluff attack, which is immediately snapped off by the Caryatid from Mike, and 2 Boros Elite come down on the 3rd turn of the game.
Yeah. Reilly was clearly quite concerned about losing his wall there, but very few tricks for a black-white deck to have in that spot that matter.
Gonzalo looks like he kept a triple 1-drop hand with 1 land, so that's not an unreasonable keep, especially in a deck that can fly over the top with Daring Skyjacks and the like.
Saying go on the first turn and then possibly only having Soldier of the Pantheon on turn 2 is pretty rough, but
it's pretty scary.
You have to keep a lot of mana-light hands with these decks.
He's able to punch through a lot of damage even though he doesn't have any burn spells, because he does have the Brave the Elements as well as sort of a little bit of evasion in the form of both Imposing Sovereign and Daring Skyjack, as we see Pelucranos the World Eater coming down on turn 3 for Mike Reilly.
And this is going to put Gonzalo to the test right now, because if he doesn't have a removal spell for that Pelucranos, Reilly could untap and potentially kill 2 creatures and make a 7/7.
The kill spells that Gonzalo has are 3 copies of Orzhov Charm, as well as 4 Banisher Priests, although the Banisher Priest's not going to be able to come down with only 2 mana in play. He also has 2 copies of Spear of Heliod, which is a card we've seen a little bit of today on camera. The Glorious Anthem artifact finally getting some love in Standard.
Yeah, it's curious. Ben Lundquist was the first person really putting up high-profile finishes with Boros. He was a huge advocate for a bunch of Ajanis and no spears. Then Pat Cox and Ben Stark did well with the black-white deck. They're big advocates for Spear, not really that big of a advocate for Ajani. And so you've seen those 2 cards, which fill kind of similar roles, fluctuate a lot depending on which proponent of the deck happens to be playing and doing well at a particular time.
Gonzalo's stepped on the brakes here as he just drops a 3rd Boros Elite in the face of the 5/5 he's facing down. Mike gets to untap at 16 life on his 4th turn, which has got to excite him a little bit.
Right, although Mike still needs to be conscious of, don't be leaning too heavily on this Pelucranos right now. You know that there is Orzhov Charm. Some of these black-white decks also have Doom Blades or Ultimate Prices to supplement it. And so even though the Pelucranos is dominant here, this can easily slip away from him if he's not careful about how large Gonzalo's board gets, or if he's sloppy about playing around Brave the Elements.
Yeah, let's not kid ourselves. He can attack for 11 to put Mike to 5. That's not a whole lot of breathing room for Mike. So when Gonzalo does get to attack, if a Brave the Elements is in his future and gets to name green, then it's a lot of damage in play.
Yeah, it would be great for Reilly to be able to diversify the color of permanents he has in play. That would take a lot of the wind out of the sails of a potential aggressive Brave the Elements.
Unfortunately, a lot of his permanents are green, including the tokens off of Advent of the Worm and Gorklan Rampager. Chain of the Rocks is white, however, and that's going to be able to take out the Soldier of the Pantheon. That Chain of the Rocks will enchant a Sacred Foundry, and then Dome Re-Raid is going to enter the battlefield.
And this is a really good turn for Reilly. He's adding to his board while also taking away Gonzalo's potential to kill him out of nowhere. So,
yeah, absolutely. And this Dome Re-Raid looks like it's going to fight with the 5/5. No Brave the Elements to save the Boros Elite, and now those Boros Elites are just 1/1s. No additional text currently.
And yeah, so if Gonzalo wants to finish off that Dome Raid, involves suiciding one of his Boros Elites into a Pelucranos, which Reilly's also happy with.
Yeah, it's already killed one Boros Elite. It would kill a second one on the way out if he decided to attack here, which I'm not sure how much choice Gonzalo has, and he does decide to attack the Dome Re-Raid. Domire dies. Precinct Captain comes down. That's still much more impressive on turn 2 or 3 than it is on turn 5 or 6.
Yes.
So Mike is able to untap with impunity here. He finds himself a Temple on top. He also has a Stormbreath Dragon in hand that can play either offense or defense against this deck because most of the creatures are white, except for Zathrid Necromancer. The Temple looks like it's going to leave whatever Mike had on top, so that's got a signal to Gonzalo that even though he's already in a bad situation, it may be about to get worse.
Yeah, also bear in mind, Reilly missed his 4th land drop, so his hand is all spells.
Yes. Attacking in for 5 with the Pelucranos is Mike Reilly to get the damage started, and he actually has a higher life total right now than Gonzalo, as he was stymied early in the game, and Mike is going to drop Witch Stalker. Witch Stalker is a card that it doesn't really appear in these types of decks very often, but Mike was definitely high on Witch Stalker when we were talking to him about this deck earlier.
Yeah, it's a threat that he says the interaction with this and Gorkland Rampager is excellent, as both blue and black decks really can't check it. And a 3-toughness hexproof creature is actually pretty rough on beatdown decks. Mono red, Boros, the Orzhov human decks we see on camera, they are a lot of 2-power creatures. So even though Witch Stalker isn't at its best here, a 3-toughness hexproof creature is still quite good.
Yeah, it's still able to trump pretty much anything Gonzalo can put onto the board since most of his creatures are 2/2s. Can't be targeted, of course, by either Orzhov Charm or Banisher Priest, and is also pretty much immune to anything Gonzalo could do here, and also gets a +1/+1 counter for defensively minded Brave the Elements. So it actually does a lot in this matchup. Looks like Mike is tapping 5 mana here, and that is going to activate Pelucranos, the World Eater.
And I'm assuming we are going to be brawling with Gonzalo's 2 small creatures.
Yep, the Daring Skyjack and the Boros lead the 2 battalion creatures. We're going to be his only offense. Unfortunately, Mike has the 5 mana that he needed to be able to fight them both. In comes a 7/7 Hydra and a 3/3 Wolf, representing a large portion of Gonzalo's life total. He doesn't really have a good block here.
No, he can chump block, but that's not really getting him anywhere. Also, keep in mind, Reilly still with that Stormbreath Dragon in his hand.
Yeah, even if he doesn't block here, he doesn't get in for the extra damage to be able to put a token onto the battlefield because of the Sylvan Caryatid.
And I really like this play from Mike of going monstrous with Pelucranos instead of playing the dragon, since if Gonzalo was going to get out of that game, it involves the board getting built up and then Brave the Elements happening.
Yes.
So it makes a lot of sense there when you have a window to contain his board and still advance yours, because you're turning your Pelucranos into a 7/7 that turn. You get to attack with your 3/3. A lot of players' instinct in that spot, I believe, is just to play the dragon. It's
Yes.
pro-white against a mono-white deck, but I actually think that play covers Mike more against the types of ways that he could lose that game.
I agree. As we move to the sideboards with Mike Reilly and his Naya deck up 1-0 on Gonzalo Velasquez and his Orzhov Humans aggro. Gonzalo stumbled that game, was not able to form any sort of cohesive offense before Mike was able to get going, and so we move to sideboards. Let's start with Mike's.
He has a copy of Chandra in his sideboard, which is excellent against the Boros and Orzhov little white creature decks, although it is worse against this build because Spear of Heliod can invalidate it. Still very good against a deck chock full of one-toughness creatures. He has additional Chain of the Rocks, 2 Mizium Mortars, 2 Shocks, 2 Hammers, 3 Xenagos, and 4 Mistcutter Hydras. Quite honestly, I think Mike is just going to bring in more removal. Just the Chandra, the Chain of Rocks, the Mortars, and the Shocks. He has plenty of ways to win the game once he's hitting 5 and 6 mana. It's getting out of the earlier turns that's the issue, and so I think he's going to want to shore that up a little bit.
So what kind of things do you think come out? Do you think he takes out the ramp in the Elvish Mystics?
I think that he should consider cutting Gorkland Rampager because he's the control deck. I think that he should consider cutting perhaps Witch Stalker, as it doesn't match up very well against Spear of Heliod. And so that gives us 6 slots to work with here.
And he's only bringing in 6 cards, so that might be a straight switch.
Right, yeah, that would be an easy swap.
Looking over at Gonzalo's side of things, he has Doomblades, 2 of them in his sideboard. I would certainly expect that card to be making an appearance here. He has a copy of Renounce the Guilds, which is a card that was much more popular several months ago in Old Standard. before return, or not before Theros, to be able to deal with any manner of Detention Sphere, and still can deal with Detention Sphere, but in this matchup would deal with Gorkland Rampager or Dome Re-Raid, Xenagos, that type of thing.
Right. It's also an answer that these decks need to Blood Baron, which is a really troubling card. So it's primarily there for Esper or Black-White decks, but it can come in random spots too against, Mono Red Devotion, for example, chock full of hybrid mana permanents, and so Renounce the Guild is a pretty flexible card.
The other cards in Gonzalo's sideboard are 1 Pithing Needle, a trio of Thoughtseize, another Necromancer, 3 Dark Betrayal, 2 Sin Collector, and 2 copies of Prophet Lost. Do you see any of them coming in? What do you think about Thoughtseize or Pithing Needle, for example?
I don't think any of those cards are likely to come in. I think he will probably bring in the 4th copy of Zathran Necromancer. Although, I caution against that. Most post-board games slow down and become more removal-oriented. In those games, Zathran Necromancer becomes a lot more powerful. That said, it's pretty easy for Reilly's deck to overpower that sort of thing. It's in a mirror match type of situation where there's a lot of trading going on. Zathran Necromancer is really powerful. But when your creatures are just fundamentally outclassed, it's harder to win that kind of fight. That said, the threat of Mizium Mortars out of this deck, and the fact that the game should be slowing down in general, become more removal-oriented, I think means that the 4th Necromancer will be coming in, though it won't be as good here as it is against a lot of other red-based or green-based aggressive decks.
Yeah, absolutely. Mike's deck is just better equipped to deal with Necromancer by not just Chain to the Rocks, of course, is really a problem for Zathran Necromancer, but the nature of Mike's deck is that he's better equipped to deal with lots of different things because he can play it instant speed more, with both Boon Satyr and Advent of the Worm.
He has Dragon to fly over.
Yeah.
He has Pleruchnos that can check it. He's got good answers that aren't actually just strict answers to it. They can also be very good in games that don't involve Zathran Necromancer.
Absolutely. So I wanted to tell a quick story. Mike came up to me at the end of the last round to talk about his deck. He's very excited about this Naya deck.
He's an excitable person.
I can see that. Having known him for many years, I'm sure you could tell me many stories about him talking, waxing poetic about his various decks. But he was very excited about this Naya deck. And one of the reasons why was because he says that he typically doesn't show up to Magic tournaments early. But this one he showed up early for whatever reason and ran into Cliff Wexler, regular Pro Tour competitor. You might remember he is the gentleman who broke his leg at Pro Tour Amsterdam.
Yes, I do.
He's grinded his way onto many a Pro Tour by winning PTQs, falling off the train, winning a PTQ, falling off. And they were talking about the red-green deck, and Mike was like, I really like the red-green deck, but I wish it had these white spells in it. And Cliff's like, interesting you say that, that's what I did. And then Mike is, really? And so they look at the deck and laid it out, and we're like, oh, this is everything I've ever wanted. He likened it to the episode of The Simpsons where Ralph brings in, we're supposed to bring in a diorama, and Ralph brings in a box of Star Wars figurines, and the principal says, Princess Leia, Boba Fett, this is everything I've ever wanted.
They're all here.
And they're all here. So Mike had all the cards he wanted in his main deck. He's got a bunch of the cards that he wanted in his sideboard, and he's been able to make it work. Cliff lost last round, so he is 5-2. Mike is still the one in the tournament with this build of Naya, and he was actually talking with Stephen Mann earlier in the week and tried to convince Stephen to play a very similar deck, but was unfortunately unable to communicate with him last night because of internet issues. As we see, Gonzalo leads off with a Thoughtseize to take Dome Re-Raid and shows Mike's hand of 4 lands and 2 removal spells.
Not a bad key from Mike. I understand the hesitation, but eventually, there's a lot of planes in this deck, a lot of white sources in this deck, rather, and the removal spells are very good, obviously, and set the table for that Dome Re that was in his hand.
Right. Gonzalo's led off with a Thoughtseize, which you thought wasn't going to come in. Do you think that that's a mistake, or is that just a play style thing?
It can be both, I guess.
Sure.
I just feel it's very hard for this deck to have black mana early on in the game, and Mike's deck is so fast to the board and redundant. It's not like he's going to have these hands that you break apart with a single Thoughtseize, and so the mixture of all this, I think I would have erred on the side of not bringing in a card like Thoughtseize.
When I was talking with Chris Van Meter last week about the green-red monsters deck, he said that one of the attractions of the deck to him was the fact that it was pretty much Thoughtseize immune. Like, he got Thoughtseized and then his opponent would see how he would lose.
Right.
As we see Mike Reilly shock a Soldier of the Pantheon, but Orzhov Charm returns it to play with its oft forgotten about Reanimate ability.
Well, the bounce a creature you control and all enchantments to your hand is actually the
That's
the real
the
forgotten
least
about
used one. Yeah. But returning a Soldier of the Pantheon to play, I imagine Doom Traveler is the most returned one-drop by Orzhov Charm in its life. But we see Pelucranos make an appearance for a brief second before it gets Doom-bladed, and Gonzalo's Soldier of the Pantheon marches on and is joined by a friend.
Reilly really needs to find white mana pronto.
Yeah, he needs to find white mana pretty quick, and he does not have it currently, but he does have Stormbreath Dragon. Usually pretty good against the white-based humans deck. However, as we see lurking in Gonzalo's hand, there is another copy of Doomblade.
Yes. The Terrors, on the other hand, I think are very good against Reilly no matter what.
Yes.
But I am suspicious of Thoughtseize.
As we see, Mike, I think, is deciding whether or not to attack here.
Well, it ultimately won't matter because of the Doomblade, but if I'm Mike, I definitely want to be on the defensive here.
Left it back on defense. End of turn, Gonzalo killed the dragon, marches in for another 4, putting Mike to 12. And there's an imposing Sovereign. Now that's really going to put a hamper on Mike's defense, as anything he plays isn't going to be able to block next turn.
And Reilly pulls up another useless forest.
And there is Gore Clan Rampager entering the battlefield tapped. It'll be good next turn, should he be able to block with it, but 6 damage is going to rumble in, putting Mike to 6.
We'll see any additional follow-up here. Banisher Priest.
Banisher Priest on the Gore Clan Rampager. I think that he's not really afraid of the Mizzou Mortars because Mike didn't play the 6th land last turn.
Well, I also think that Gonzalo's last card might have been Brave the Elements too.
So Gonzalo is able to take game 2 to even up the score against Mike Reilly.
Kept a hand without white mana, never found it in time, and that was that.
There you go. Had 2 copies of Chain to the Rocks, but was basically a mulligan to 5.
Yeah, and you can see in that game why I was not a big fan of keeping in Rampager. It's pretty low impact, and the fact that it can't block Soldier of the Pantheon is also an issue.
Absolutely, and gain some life.
Yes. So I'm not sure exactly what he cut to make room for all of that removal. He probably did some shaving, I would guess, but maybe he cut some number of the Boon Satyrs because they aren't great at blocking in this matchup. That's reasonable too, but I think Rampager is not where Mike wants to be. I think he just wants to be all removal and bombs, basically, in this matchup.
Meanwhile, for Gonzalo, he did end up bringing in the Thoughtseizes and looking, as the Boros Elites weren't that impressive in Game 1, it's possible that he doesn't have them in anymore because they don't really match up against all of Mike's 4/4s and 5/5s.
I've played a lot of Boros. I played Black-White at the Invitational, and you take out Boros Elite in a lot of matchups just because if your opponent is sideboarding against you, it's almost always removal.
Yes.
And getting to Battalion is much harder than it is in Game 1s in almost every matchup you play. So if there's not any card that strikes you as being obviously the worst card, it's often correct to be removing Boros Elite.
That's fair enough. He does have a lot of 1-drops as it is. He does have Soldier of the Pantheons and Dryad Militants, so it's not like he's wanting for more 1-drops in his deck.
Yeah, but once your opponent's bringing in a bunch of Shocks and Mortars, it's just hard to get to Battalion.
Gets to be a problem. Although you can counter that by bringing in Thoughtseize. And around we go.
Right, and around you go.
So Gonzalo will be on the draw this time, which makes those Thoughtseizes a little bit worse, although mostly he's trying to snag 3-drops, like 4-mana spells like Pelucranos.
Yeah, the biggest issue is, if he has black mana early on in the game. It's not like Thoughtseize is low in power. Obviously, it's one of the best, in my mind, the second best card in Standard behind Mutavault. The issue is in Velasquez's deck, it's very hard for him to have untapped black early in the game. He has 3 Swamps and 4 Godless Shrines. And if he's not casting in on turn 1 or turn 2, Mike can get out in front with mana creatures and start playing the cards that Gonzalo actually needs to be Thoughtseizing away.
Yeah, absolutely. You don't really need Orzhov Charm on turn 2. You don't really need Zathra Necromancer on turn 3, although it helps to have it on turn 3. But 3 Swamps, 4 Godless Shrine, 4 Temple of Silence, that's only 11 black sources in Gonzalo's deck, so it's not completely realistic to expect to have a turn 1 Thoughtseize.
Yeah, and no, he's got some black sources, but given how Thoughtseize is probably mediocre at best against Reilly to begin with.
Absolutely, yeah.
It calls into question bringing it in. Although it was good that game.
It was very good that game when Mike had the 2 removal spells, 4 lands, and 1 impact card.
Right.
Although if he sees a hand of Mana Elf, Sylvan Caryatid, 4-drop, 4-drop, it's going to be a lot worse.
Yes. And I think the Thoughtseizes actually get worse on the draw because Velasquez needs to be like faster to the board because, time is not on his side. He needs to be the aggressor, and he's already kind of on the back foot in terms of that when he's on the draw. And having Thoughtseizes and needing to spend mana that way and hoping to have black mana to be able to cast them in the first place, all that adds up and becomes more impactful when he's on the draw.
Yeah. I did not see Gonzalo re-sideboard, however, so I believe those Thoughtseizes are still in his deck. As we see Mike looking at his opening hand, deciding if he can keep. The pairing of Mountain, Advent of the Worm as the front 2 cards.
Yeah, a good summary of the deck right there.
Yes. The sample hands from this deck are quite interesting.
Yeah.
With Temple Garden, Plains, Forest, or not Plains, but Temple Garden, Forest, Chain to the Rocks, for example.
This is certainly a deck that I believe is eagerly anticipating having 4 more temples it can play.
Absolutely. Gonzalo is going to mulligan his opener. He's still going to need an aggressive draw, even if it's only on 6 cards. He's going to probably need to go 1-drop, 2-drop at least, although 2-drop, 3-drop is not that bad. But Mike is going to be able to hit the board very quickly. I think that this game might hinge on whether or not Mike is able to land Sylvan Caryatid on turn 2. That's just going to spell doom no matter what comes next from Gonzalo, as we see turn 1 Elvish Mystic, which is also a pretty good start.
Yes.
Soldier of the Pantheon from Gonzalo. And depending on what Mike has in his hand, he might decide to just leave this Elvish Mystic back. He looks like Mike has a very land-heavy hand. Although it does have an Advent of the Worm and a Pelucranos, so he probably wants this Mystic and it won't be blocking.
Yeah, I would be surprised if he offers up this trade. Although he has a Rampager, he played the Sacred Foundry tap, so. All right, he'll offer up.
He'll offer up a trade, attacking Gonzalo down to 17, currently winning. Mike falls to 18 thanks to the 2-1 on turn 1, and there's a Boros Elite and a Temple of Silence. Gonzalo's hand does include a Brave the Elements, something to keep in mind as this game progresses. It also has Daring Skyjack and Zathrid Necromancer, so it's not want for power. I think at this point he's just looking for a land, and since Gonzalo left a card on top, my guess is that he is going to be able to find it next turn.
But keep in mind, this Naya deck can actually go beatdowns pretty effectively itself, especially with Advent of the Worm, which I believe Reilly will have access to on the 3rd turn.
He does have access to it, but instead Pelucranos is going to be the option, it looks like. Deciding whether or not to play it, there it is. The legendary Hydra from Heroes vs. Monsters, although that one's the Theros version.
And I assume that we have a Doomblade, we're going to see it, and if not, then
nope. Well,
this
things are going to get a little bit awkward now because Mike is going to have access to 5 mana and once again be able to fight 2 different creatures.
Pelucranos, the slayer of small white creatures. That's everywhere.
Right. And here is 5 mana. Looks like he's going to use 4 of it currently. Nope, deciding to use it all to be able to fight the Soldier of the Pantheon and the Daring Skyjack, leaving Gonzalo with not but a Boros Elite here on turn 4.
And the Pelucranos, I believe, can safely attack. 7/7 with 5 damage on it.
Yep, and it will. There is 7, dropping Gonzalo to half of his life total. Well within Hitgetsugu's second right range. In comes the 1-1. Got to start somewhere.
I guess, yeah.
Dropping Mike to 15. And he has a Godless Shrine in his hand, so he's deciding if he wants to play the Godless Shrine untapped. I think he has a Banisher Priest to be able to take down the Pelucranos. The danger of that is it resets the Pelucranos for later if Mike has a shock or anything.
Well, assuming that Velasquez doesn't have access to any other removal spell, then he has to just cast Banisher Priest this turn. He can't worry about Mike having cards left over since it's very hard for Gonzalo to actually beat anything extra that Mike has at this point.
Imposing Sovereign is the play, and he plays a Godless Shrine untapped to be able to brave the elements to block Unfortunately for him, I believe there's a Gore Clan Rampager in Mike's hand to make that 7/7 quite large. Oh, and by the way, trampling.
Yes. I mean, his hand is. He has a Domery, a Dragon,
He has it all, like we mentioned earlier. This deck has it all, and currently his hand has it all.
Yes. You
And
can see what he was talking about.
Yep. And so it looks like Domery Raid is going to be the initial play. He's going to try and fight this imposing Sovereign, but in response, Brave the Elements for green is going to be named. It's not really going to matter because attacking for 7, attacking for 11 puts you to -2, and that's the match. So Mike Reilly moving to 7-1. New Jersey native Mike
Yes.
Reilly.